as well. We're going to go over to bring on board our panelists. We have 3 panelists coming on board: Mike Davis, Anna Lappe, and Jahi Chappell. So we can start perhaps with Mike Davis, who I'm sure all of you know, prolific writer, activist, historian, and an award-winning author. His classics include the Ecology of Fear, the Late Victorian Holocaust, and most recently on COVID-19 and other diseases, The Monster Enters. He's also co-author of the forthcoming Set the Night on Fire, LA in the 60s. Where does he find the time to write so much is something I find amazing. But a real warm welcome to you, Mike. I understand what you'd really like to sort of highlight is how the China hawks weaponized COVID. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you. Before I start my 5 minutes, however, I just want to say that I've been a friend and admirer of Rob for a very long time, but also equally an admirer of his incredible parents, Roderick and Deborah. And I hope Rob will find a moment later in this discussion to plug their new book as well. They really are outstanding. And I was honored years ago when I was an editor at Verso to publish a book of theirs, which I think is still on the Verso backlist. But anyway, at the beginning of June, when New Yorkers were first creeping out of their apartments, some of them may have looked up in the sky and seen a very strange sight, which was a plane trailing a huge long banner that's announced the birth of the Federal Republic of New China. This was followed by an announcement by Steve Bannon and his outlaw billionaire friend, Guo Wengui, that essentially a government in exile had been created, and they were proposing to liberate the Chinese. As a result of his various dealings with other Chinese billionaires, of course, Bannon's now under indictment. And this may have seemed a really comic opera stunt to pull. But at the same time, one of the major geopolitical aspects of the pandemic has been the extraordinary success of the China hawks, the advocates of a new Cold War with China, and dangerously perhaps a hot war as well, to instrumentalize COVID to advance their program. In fact, one of the first people in the administration to grasp the seriousness, potential seriousness of the pandemic was on January 3rd, Matthew Pottinger, who's a deputy national security advisor, who had been a Wall Street Journal reporter in China during the SARS epidemic, then became a Marine, and then ended up in the Trump administration. He immediately saw the potential danger of this, but also the enormous opportunity it gave to the China hawks. Now, at this point, of course, in January, the administration was in the midst of trying to conclude a trade agreement with China so that the President Trump could declare victory in his tariff wars. And the upper hand seemed to be held by the globalists in the administration, those who supported the terrorists, but with the aim of coming eventually to a compromise that would force the Chinese to make concessions on things like intellectual property, but in no sense to begin to dismantle the interdependence of the Chinese and US economies, or globalization itself. And they, of course, were led by Steve Mnuchin, the Secretary of Treasury, and also in the beginning by Goldman Sachs representative in the early Trump administration, Gary Kahn, and others like Larry Kudlow of the National Economic Committee, McMaster's, who was National Security Advisor, John Kelly, who was Chief of Staff. All these people, except for Mnuchin, of course, have left, but they held kind of the upper hand in January and seem to be the ones who might steer the COVID crisis. But Pottinger went to his boss, Robert O'Brien, the National Security Advisor, and then to Tom Cotton, the supposed, glamour boy of post-Trump Republican Party, and to Peter Navarro, who we all know is a singularly nasty character in the administration. And they were the basic quartet, with Steve Bannon kind of hovering over them as the ghost of Cold War's past, that began pressing an agenda which had the following points. First of all, the virus is China's fault. Maybe it was developed deliberately by the military in a laboratory, but in any extent, it's all on China and the Chinese conspiracy. Secondly, engagement with China has failed. This is what Mike Pompeo announced in July in a major speech. There was a repudiation, basically, of Nixon's opening to China in 50 years of US relations with China. It was a real declaration of war. And the assertion that whatever China pretended to be in front of the world, they're the same old group of Stalinists, the same communists they always were. Another point was that there was a silver lining to COVID, and that would allow us to repatriate not only the production lines for personal protective equipment and vital medicines, but further accelerate deglobalization, of which they were advocates. It would also help coerce allies to join the new Cold War. And a little bit later, Republicans added it was time for China to pay for the pandemic that they had unleashed. And congressional Republicans were even talking about canceling the United States' $1 trillion debt to China. Now, this agenda, as I say, in the beginning, faced tremendous opposition from the Treasury Department and others. But as the opponents were whittled down basically to Mnuchin himself and a few others, they gained control over the administration's depiction of the pandemic. It was a little tricky because from their position, and it was necessary to underline the severity and danger of the pandemic, which at times put them in a dissonant relationship to the administration's attempts to underplay the pandemic. And in fact, Pottinger and Navarro had been warning from the very beginning in January on the need to take this seriously, where Pottinger was the only guy in the White House going around in a mask from the very beginning of this. Other people laughed at him. So they had to overcome the kind of contradiction between emphasizing the dangers of it and keeping Trump's support. But Trump very quickly, of course, bought into this completely because he saw it as key to his re-election strategy. And as I say, by July, with a huge group of other Republicans on board, people like Liz Cheney, uh, uh, Attorney General Barr, Rubio, Christie, you know, it go on and on. By July, came this announcement that, in fact, was basically a declaration of economic war with China. Full stop, no compromise, no surrender. That remains the Trump policy today. Now, I wonder if we're still around and are able to look back on this a couple of years hence, how we'll see the COVID pandemic in geopolitical terms. And I fear one question that has to be asked is, will it be seen as the Sarajevo of what the serious foreign policy place increasingly worries might be a hot war with China? Thank you.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you for those. That's really excellent, Mike. I know you have two hungry teenagers, both hungry bodily and presumably also for their intellect too. So I just wonder whether we can just change our order around a little. Would you stay on a little bit longer just to take a few questions from people who are attending? Mel, would you like to read out any particular questions you think are important for us to take at this stage?
Sure. So there are a few questions. I think there's one that might be could be saved for later because it's about how to move forward. The first one is from James Wilberforce, and he's wondering about the importance, given what's known so far about some of the possible causes for the pandemic that have been in the media, such as the wet markets or the Wuhan lab, etc. If anyone has any comments on that. The second one is from Brian Napolitano. He has a long quote which could be read in the chat. I'm not going to read the whole thing in the chat here, but it was a quote from the recent Jacobin interview with Catherine Yee and Martin Koldorf. His question about this is, what is your response to the central tenet of the quote from that article that containment is an unrealistic endeavor? If not, what more needs to be done to contain the pandemic, and how does it interrelate to the structural changes needed to address the underlying causes of the pandemic, including agroecology, breaking a hierarchy of international commodity chains, etc.? So those are big questions, but if anyone has some sort of way to say it succinctly, some of this may be addressed in the succeeding panelists. So I'm going to open that up.
Thanks, Mel. Mike, would you like to have a go at some of that?
Yeah, let me just respond to the second question. I'll let others talk to the first point. Containment works. It works in China, and Taiwan, and South Korea. And most incredible example of a successful containment, of course, has been Vietnam. And in all these cases, whether you call the societies authoritarian or democratic, all characterized by powerful grassroots organization, something that's not much talked about here. I mean, we live in a country with, but for a few exceptions, we're basically told if there's a disaster, hoard toilet paper and bottled water and wait to be dug out of the rubble. We don't know who our neighbors are. If there's an earthquake, we don't have a clue about, the old person down the street that needs their gas on. When there's a pandemic, we don't have a list of the health workers in the neighborhood to help stop false rumors, and so on. But the most singular disasters, of course, have been in countries that have most fervently embraced neoliberalism. The United States, Great Britain, the actually existing neoliberal Sweden of today, not the social democratic people's homeland of yesterday. In all three of these cases, the solution has been, instead of acting, to do everything possible to protect the economy profits at the expense of the soaring number of deaths, particularly of old people. And it's clear right now, particularly with, what's his name, Alex Cortez, the doctor who's the replacement for Fauci by Trump's side, the administration has gone back and now it's publicly adopted the herd immunity strategy, which is basically to sacrifice older people, people with pre-existing conditions. It's a neo-Nazi policy. And there's no way, the great need to understand it in that terms. The Nazis had this horrible term, which they applied to senile and mentally ill people that they proposed to kill. And what it was translated from German, it said people unworthy of life. Now, about half the people, perhaps 100,000 people, have died in nursing homes in this country. Mainly poor people, probably majority Black and Latino. This was entirely preventable. But they apparently, to the Trump administration and also to any number of governors, including Democrats, people not worthy of life. Thanks again.
Thank you, Mike. I mean, I think that's absolutely to the point. I think we need to call it what it is, the eugenicist approach of the fascists. And I think that is becoming more and more apparent in my view. But thank you very much for joining us today, Mike. And I'm sorry that you can't stay longer, but parental duties call. So all the best, and hope we'll interact with you again soon. Thank you.
Buy the book. Thank you.
Great. Our next speaker is Anna Lappé, who is the James Beard Award-winning co-founder of the Small Planet Institute.